Hey there. So the podcast is currently on an extended hiatus so that I can write my next book and work on some other exciting projects. But while we're away, I hope you'll enjoy this fan favorite episode from the archives. If you want brand new content to help you make peace with food and heal from diet culture, come sign up for my free weekly newsletter at christyharrison.com/newsletter, where I answer a weekly listener question. And as always, if you join my Intuitive Eating Fundamentals course at christyharrison.com/course, you get access to our exclusive monthly Q&A podcast where I answer all your new questions. Just go to christyharrison.com/newsletter and christyharrison.com/course to sign up, or click the links in the episode description. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, and author of the book Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is available wherever books are sold. Join me here every week as I interview interesting people from all different backgrounds about their paths toward peace with food in their bodies. And by the way, on this show, we bleep out diet culture stuff like weight and calorie numbers, but we don't censor swear words or other adult language, so listener discretion is advised.
Anti-diet revolution, we're for health at every size. Eat the foods you like. Food Psych.
Hey there, welcome to episode 222 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with fellow anti-diet dietitian and podcaster Heather Kaplan. We talk about her experience with orthorexia, aka obsession with healthy eating, how to bring joyful movement into eating disorder recovery, how privilege affects health and athletic performance, sports nutrition from an intuitive eating perspective, and so much more. It's a great conversation, and I cannot wait to share it with you in just a moment. But first, I'll answer this week's listener question, which is from a listener named Chelsea, who writes, I've dabbled a bit in intuitive eating, read the book back in 2014 when I was still recovering from anorexia, and then kind of walked the gray line over the last 3 to 4 years. I have had lots of food rules and also gone through a fair deal of digestive issues in the past. Once I no longer was dealing with digestive issues, I decided to really commit to intuitive eating and get rid of my food rules, buy ice cream and sugar cereal, and all the typical things that diet culture influences us to restrict. The issue I'm facing is that I feel like I quote-unquote should eat pizza because intuitive eating says it's acceptable, and I have a really hard time figuring out if I am truly craving pizza versus what I feel like I quote-unquote should have as a fuck you to diet culture. Do you have any advice for working through this? Is this just part of the process of making peace with food? Also, do you have advice on breaking habitual eating habits like having a sweet before bed? Again, this is just one of those things that I've told myself I should have, and it's really hard to know if it's just a routine or if I'm really craving one at this point. So thanks, Chelsea, for that great question. And before I answer, just my standard disclaimer that these answers and this podcast in general are for informational and educational purposes only and are not a substitute for individual medical or mental health advice. So yeah, this is a very common phase to go through when you're starting to get back to intuitive eating. And I think it's totally understandable given the culture that we live in, and also given what you personally went through in your own relationship with food. So diet culture trains us to want rules and to want to know that we're quote unquote doing it right, because every diet has its rules, every diet has its ways that you're quote unquote doing it right. And so it's really normal to ask yourself questions like, am I really craving this, or am I just rebelling against diet culture? And is this something I genuinely want, or is it just a habit? And especially when you've had an eating disorder, it can feel so important to know the answer to those questions and to choose what feels like the quote unquote right answer. Right, of course, being the answer that diet culture would prefer. Because in diet culture, we're conditioned to believe that it's quote unquote bad to eat something out of rebellion or out of habit, or to eat sweets before bed, right? Or to eat pizza. And so, diet culture's quote unquote right thing is like, oh no, I don't actually feel like a sweet, or oh no, I'm not actually craving pizza. So it's really, I think this is a sneaky form of diet mentality that's creeping in to your intuitive eating practice. And that's so common and so understandable for anyone in diet culture and for anyone coming out of an eating disorder. So my best advice to you would be try to stop overthinking it. If the idea of eating pizza pops into your head when you're thinking about what to have for lunch or whatever, just go with it and try not to second guess it. And then you can notice, is it satisfying? Do you enjoy it? How satisfied do you feel after eating it? Did it taste good? Did it make you feel content and ready to push the plate away and move on to other things when you were done eating? Or were you left wanting more? Were you left wanting different flavors? There's no wrong answer here. It's all a process of learning and figuring out what works for you and what's satisfying for you in the moment. And the beauty of intuitive eating is that if you don't feel very satisfied by a particular meal, it's not a problem, right? You have a million other meals in the future to find more satisfaction. And sometimes meals just aren't as satisfying as we thought they'd be. And that's okay. It's totally not quote unquote doing it wrong if you thought something would be really satisfying and it wasn't. You're still doing intuitive eating, even if the thing you thought would bring you satisfaction ended up being sort of meh, like not that good. And you're also allowed to eat the meh thing again if it sounds good the next time you're thinking about what to eat. There's really nothing wrong with you if you circle back to that food a bunch of times, even after realizing it's not that satisfying or having it be not that satisfying one time. Because sometimes we just need to do that circling back in order to come to our own conclusions, in order to really discover what we feel and what we think. And something that's not satisfying one day can also be deeply satisfying another day, just because of what we're in the mood for that particular day. So I think it's important to give yourself room and time and space for a lot of experimentation with intuitive eating, and just know that there's no quote unquote doing it wrong or doing it right. I also want to assure you that you're still doing intuitive eating if you thought you might be choosing something just out of rebellion, but you ended up finding that you really were satisfied by it. So remember, intuitive eating is all about having full, unconditional permission to eat for any reason. And that means even if the reason seems like it's a rebellion or habit or anything else, right? We're allowed to eat for whatever reason we feel like. And we practice non-judgment. We practice not judging ourselves for our food choices. And it's true that early in your intuitive eating process, you might have some rebellion against diet culture, some reflexive gravitation towards the foods that diet culture has deemed off limits, because you need to show yourself that those foods really are allowed and that they're not going anywhere, that they're not going to be taken away again. And that's what I call the honeymoon phase of intuitive eating, a phase that many people, not everyone, but many people go through, where all you want is those foods that were previously off limits and you just can't get enough of them, and you're eating them in part just to prove to yourself that you can. But over time, if you can allow yourself to go through that phase and give yourself permission to eat those foods and not second guess yourself, eventually you do reach a place where you'll want other foods too. And there won't be this feeling of compulsion around the previously off limits foods, because you'll know you can have them anytime you want. And that is when you truly become free with food, because when you trust in your bones that nothing is off limits, then you get to make your own choices rather than reflexively following diet culture's rules or rebelling against them, because you're still being controlled by diet culture in that sense. And remember, there's nothing wrong with rebelling against the rules. It's a natural part of coming out of that regime, but it's not the full expression of autonomy with food. And you're going to get to that full expression of autonomy if you can allow yourself to be in the rebellious place and go through it. For most of us, it's really important to go through that phase of rebelling and really pushing the envelope in order to get to a place where we can make the decisions we truly want to make for ourselves, not for anyone else, right? In order to get to a place of full autonomy. So I'll share a little story, kind of an analogous story from my own life here, which is that when I was 16 and 17, in late high school and driving, my parents were pretty strict about my curfew. I had a 12:30 a.m. curfew, which was actually fairly generous compared to many people I know now. But at the time, a lot of my friends didn't have curfews at all, or if they did, it was later than 12:30 and, on a case-by-case basis and not a hard and fast rule. But for me, if I was home 5 minutes late, 5 minutes past 12:30, my dad would be waiting for me with a mini lecture and kind of pacing back and forth and annoyed because he wanted to go to bed. That's why my curfew was 12:30, because he wanted to go to bed, right? And he couldn't go to bed until I was home. And the later I was, the further after 12:30 I came home, the more lecturing I got. And if I was really late, I would get yelled at and have some sort of privilege taken away, like being grounded or not being allowed to drive a car for a week or things like that. So what do you think I did with that 12:30 curfew? I tested the limits all the damn time, right? I stayed out past curfew. I left my friends' houses with too little time to spare and, sped on the road to try to get back, but it was 5-10 minutes late. I would totally blow it off sometimes and not call to let them know I'd be late, et cetera, et cetera. I just really tested them in big and small ways. And then when I turned 18 and was about to go off to college, suddenly my parents decided, I think through my mom's influence, honestly, that I didn't need to have a curfew anymore. I was 18, I was an adult. I needed to get used to setting my own limits and stuff. So they lifted the curfew. There was no more curfew. And so at first, I stayed out really, really late, or sometimes I didn't come home at all and just stayed over at friends' houses and really tested them on this whole no curfew thing. Like I was really not sure they meant it. So and this was all not totally conscious, right? I can see this looking back now, but I was really testing the boundaries here. And then when I went to college and I wasn't living with my parents anymore, I really let loose. I went to parties and stayed out till 2, 3, 4 in the morning. I stayed out super, super late most of the time when I went out. And I stayed up really late too with my friends in the dorms. But eventually, after a few years of staying out late because I finally could and staying up late because I finally could, something interesting happened. I started noticing my own desires to stay out or go home, my own tiredness and how it felt in my body, my own energy levels. And I started to be able to make choices based on how I actually felt, rather than following some arbitrary rule that was set by an authority figure and someone outside myself. And I was able to start feeling in my body when I was ready to go home, when I was tired. And I could also feel in my body when I was having fun and when I wanted to stay out, no matter what time it was, right? So the times varied all over the map. Sometimes I'd be exhausted and go home by 10 o'clock. Sometimes I'd have tons of energy and not want the night to end, even at 4:30 in the morning or whatever. And so, it really ebbed and flowed. Now, obviously, my appetite for staying out late has changed a bit as I've gotten older, which is often true of our appetites for food, actually. Like our tastes can change over time, over the years, and there's nothing wrong with any of that. Our bodies can change, our preferences and desires can change. But, getting back to this analogy, like I also still definitely sometimes have those nights where I'm out with friends and feeling on top of the world and want to stay out, even though it's way past my usual bedtime. So the point of all this is just to say that when you're living under a regime of someone else's rules, when you're following the rules set by an authority figure, it's completely understandable to be drawn to do the exact opposite of what they say and to feel disconnected from your own desires at first. But as you get farther and farther away from following those rules, you start to recognize what really satisfies you and makes you feel good. And sometimes that can take a long time and a lot of practice, right? Like it took me a couple years to really get the hang of noticing when I was tired and ready to go home and not just be rebelling against the curfew that I had had before. But eventually it will come. Eventually, when you give yourself time and practice, you will start to notice your own desires and those will take over. And so Chelsea, who asked the question, I know that can be true for you with food as well. Just trust that you're right where you need to be right now and try to stop second guessing things. Just allow yourself to have what pops into your mind, what sounds good, and you can decide whether or not it was satisfying afterwards, and you can ask yourself the next time what sounds good and see what pops into your head again, and just keep giving yourself the permission to eat what you want, when you want, the full unconditional permission to eat for any reason. Because eventually your own desires really will emerge loud and clear, but right now try to enjoy the process of experimenting. So I hope that helps. And if you want to submit your own question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode, you can go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. And then if you want to ask me any question you want and have me answer it a lot more quickly than I can on this podcast, you can join my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. There, I teach the principles of intuitive eating in depth, and I also do an exclusive monthly Q&A podcast just for course participants. We also have a private community forum for course participants so that you can have daily guidance from my team and from me, as well as hundreds of other great folks who are on this intuitive eating path. A participant named Lisa said, "I've just finished with Module 9, and I really feel like I'm less obsessive about food these days and have stopped restricting. It's such a relief." And a participant named Kareen said, "I enrolled in the Intuitive Eating Fundamentals course, and it is fabulous and so helpful. I finally realized that my body is not a problem. Like it finally settled deep into my soul, and I finally believed it. And I've been able to stop obsessing about food. The freedom is incredible. I feel such a debt of gratitude to you for what you're doing. I knew I was spending too much time and energy focusing on food and exercise and worrying about my body, but I had no idea how much of my life it was sucking away until I was on the other side. And I can never go back. My life has opened up, and I have the headspace to pursue things I'd never imagined." If you're ready to break free from diet culture and reclaim the life it stole from you, you can learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my book, Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is now available wherever books are sold. It's a great companion to this podcast because it goes into depth about diet culture and the ways it harms us with tons of scientific references and resources to help you make the anti-diet case to people in your life. The book also lays out the foundation of intuitive eating and helps you start making peace with food in your body. Just go to christyharrison.com/book to get it, or walk into any bookstore and ask for Anti-Diet. And by the way, if you've read the book already and loved it, and I know a number of you have, then I would be psyched if you left an Amazon review. Those reviews help more people discover the book, which helps grow the anti-diet movement and ultimately helps make the world a safer place for people of all shapes and sizes, including the very largest sizes. So thank you for reading the book if you have, or for planning to read it if you haven't already, and I'm so grateful for all of you. And now, without any further ado, let's go talk to Heather Kaplan. So tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
Well, first, I will say I grew up with a lot of privileges, so I think it's important to acknowledge that. I'm white. I grew up pretty financially secure, never thought much about money, and we always had food in our house. I had one working parent and one parent, my mom, who stayed home with us while we were little. So we mostly had home-cooked meals and lots of different options. We didn't have a lot of restrictions in the house, but I do also very vividly remember growing up in a household that was very health conscious. So I think I noticed an interest in health and a lot of talk about what was healthy and what wasn't from a pretty early age. And I think when I look back on it now, I'm actually surprised that we didn't have more restrictions in our household. But from what I can remember, we did have a lot of food freedom. We had like treats every night, and we had, a home cooked meal that we ate as a family. We were forced to eat vegetables most of the time, but we all got over it. And the only things that I really remember kind of looking back on it with my, with hindsight now is like, we didn't have a lot of sugary cereals. I'm putting like air quotes around like high sugar cereals. We usually only had like diet drink options, like diet sodas or diet Cokes, and a lot of low fat everything. But, it was like the late 80s, early 90s. So we're par for the course. Right?
Yeah.
So yeah, other than that, again, I think when I look at like early childhood, I do remember a lot of food freedom and having a like quote unquote normal relationship with food. We all played sports, so we were pretty active as well. When I get into high school, I definitely remember pretty big shifts. And I think part of that was my younger sister. She's about 2 years younger than me, and she went through a growth spurt in middle school. So I was just starting high school and suddenly was like as tall as me, which was new, and very lean and very thin. And there were like lots of comments about that. Many people noticed it and had something to say about it. And she was a track runner, so just really active. And she started kind of changing the way that she was eating, probably for reasons that are somewhat obvious now. There was a lot of attention on her body, and that kind of brought a lot of attention onto my body from my perspective. And this was mostly just something that I internalized. It wasn't really said to me, but we have very different body types. And I just remember like in early high school becoming very aware of that, especially since now like we could conceivably share clothes and like, we looked similar in age, but I felt like my body was so different than hers. So that's kind of the first time I remember having a heightened awareness of that. And then throughout high school, I put myself on my first diet around age 15 for reasons I could not begin to tell you. I really don't have any like memory of what was going on in my head. But I was 15. I remember being a sophomore in high school and deciding that I wanted to try the Atkins diet. So suddenly decided I wasn't eating carbs anymore. And thankfully, I didn't actually know what that meant. So I remember like having M&Ms for lunch one day, or I was like part of my lunch. And when I look back, I'm like, yeah, those were carbohydrates. But yeah, so I just remember shifting a lot of what I was eating. And I don't remember how long this lasted. It doesn't feel like it lasted that long. But something that stands out to me is my parents briefly expressed concern, but didn't really stop me from doing anything. Not that I'm pointing a finger of blame at them, but there wasn't really anyone who said like, hey, why are you doing this? Or you don't need to. It's just kind of like, we're not sure this is healthy, but anyway, moving on. And so I remember doing that. And again, it didn't last that long. I was like, this doesn't feel very fun, so I'm not going to do this anymore. But then about a year later, I was in the summer between my junior year and my senior year of high school, I started reading a health-focused magazine that I don't remember how I got my hands on, but then suddenly I had a subscription to it. So it was coming to our house every month. And my mom had like Cooking Lights, and like other kind of diety magazines around every once in a while. So I think I probably just picked up on that a little bit and then got interested in this magazine, which was geared more towards younger women, I guess, and started reading a lot and changing a lot of my behaviors. I remember being on like a family vacation and deciding all of a sudden, like, I don't drink anymore. Like I just made that rule in my head out of nowhere while we were on vacation in Hawaii. And I remember feeling like very empowered and like, okay, well, if I could do one thing, I could do something else. And we all know how that spirals.
Slippery slope.
Right. So my senior year of high school, I played soccer. I was still an athlete, still very active, but I just remember making very slow, conscious decisions to change the way I was eating. I was still very kind of body conscious and had, I would say, pretty poor body image. Again, compared myself pretty often to my sister, who was like tall and lean. And even though I lived in a small body and had a lot of thin privilege, I didn't know that or have the language for that at the time. And I just felt very conscious of the way that I looked. So made a lot of these kind of smaller decisions that eventually really piled on. And suddenly I had tons of food rules and was restricting my eating. And going into college, I became pretty anxious about leaving. I moved across the country and went to a very different school and a very different culture. Like I grew up in the Southwest and I went to school on the East Coast. And I thought that would be great. And I was very excited about it. But as the move got closer and closer, I could see in hindsight, my behaviors got more and more rigid and my rules were very strict. And I was reading the magazines like voraciously, wanting more information. I was like, I'm going to study nutrition. This is going to be great. And the move was really tough on me. I remember being like very homesick most of my first freshman semester, and lost a lot of weight pretty quickly and thought in my head, I was like, I'm being healthy. I'm studying nutrition. So there were a lot of things that were justified in very backwards ways. And yeah, it just kind of little things that added up and kind of got me to that point. And then, of course, as we know, studying nutrition did not help anything.
Do you feel like you were attracted to the study of nutrition because of your own issues? Like, do you think that was a major driving force?
100%. there's no question in my mind. I actually, when I applied for college in the fall of my senior year of high school, I was interested in architecture. There was nothing else I wanted to do. I wanted to be an architecture student. I applied to architecture schools. I had a portfolio. Like, I was not like a math and science person. So I also, for some reason, got like very intimidated about the idea of like taking math in college. I don't know why. Like, I did perfectly fine in math, but I was like, oh, I can't take like calculus in college, which then I actually did take the fall semester of my freshman year because I thought I wanted to be an architecture student. So, but yeah, I got to college and I met with an advisor, and I hadn't initially gotten into the architecture school. So it's a really small program. And then they suggest if you want to go in, you take a couple of classes your freshman year and then reapply at the end of the year. And so that was my plan. And I met with this advisor and I said, well, the other thing I'm kind of interested in is nutrition. And she asked why. And I said, I read this magazine, and I actually had read a quote from a Penn State professor of nutrition in one of the articles in the magazine. So I was like, oh, cool, I'm going to go do that. Like, I could do that. That sounds great. So that shifted for me kind of over the summer. And then I talked to this advisor about it. And she said, well, why don't you take this Nutrition 101 course this fall, which I did. And I have a really vivid memory of being on the hub lawn, which is like this big, student union, this huge grassy lawn in front of it. I remember sitting on the lawn talking to a friend about my nutrition course. I was like, they were helping me study for an exam. And I said, I feel like I have too much information, because in my brain, with the knowledge I was learning in that class, I was like, this rule became stricter. This rule became more rigid. This food was eliminated. That, like, I remember my professor saying something about French fries that then I was like, oh, I'm never eating French fries again, So I remember saying to this friend of mine, I feel like I have too much information, and they had no idea what I meant. But in my head, I was like, this stuff is just like spiraling in my head. And I feel like I can't think about anything else.
Wow. So you really had an intuition that something was wrong, that it wasn't helping you.
Right.
But it sounds like it wasn't something you could really articulate or sort of do anything about necessarily.
Right. And I think because healthy eating and an interest in health is so normalized, and because in a nutrition class especially, you're supposed to be interested in that and you're supposed to be learning it, I just didn't question it. I think there was one part of my brain that recognized, like, this might be a little too much. You might be taking this a little too far. But most of my brain was disordered. So most of my brain was like, no, this is great. Grasp onto it and hold it tightly.
I can totally identify with that. I feel like I didn't go to school to become a dietitian, study nutrition until later, but it was very much that same kind of thing of like feeling overwhelmed by all the material and the information and feeling triggered by some of it, but not necessarily having the language to say that or to understand like all of this is feeding your disorder, or to see, because I think it's really interesting that your orthorexia, it sounds like, was really triggered by reading health magazines. And I think about that now as a health journalist and someone who went in, my first career was in health and nutrition journalism, right out of college, fully disordered, like so disordered with food, right? And like obsessed with it because I was not getting enough because of the restriction, and got into positions as an editor or writer at these magazines that I was given a lot of authority, just writing and editing for major magazines, that is a certain amount of authority because people read that and are like, okay, I'm going to try this, whatever this person says, it feels like gospel, even when they're just a journalist who never studied nutrition, who starts to specialize in nutrition journalism because of their own disordered behaviors or their own disordered thinking. And that disordered thinking is so rewarded. I talked recently in a podcast episode about this with Maxine Ali, who was also a wellness journalist. And, we talked about how like the people who rise in that field often tend to be the most disordered, and going into it can totally exacerbate disordered eating too. And so it's so interesting that this magazine, that I'd be willing to bet the people who are writing those articles had their own disordered relationships with food. I think you kind of can't escape that working in health media, either being attracted to it because of your own disorder or just like becoming more disordered in that milieu because you're surrounded by just, diet culture thoughts all the time. I'm willing to bet that the people who are writing that content had their own diet culture experience and their own disordered relationship with food that you were experiencing as like, oh, this is the way, this is what I should be doing, this is healthy, quote unquote. And like, that's so how culture transmits this stuff generationally too.
Right. So I think at that time in my life, just being 17, 18 years old and going to college in a totally different environment from what I knew, there was part of me that was so unsure of like who I was and what I was supposed to be doing and how I fit in at this enormous university in this totally different place, that I was just sort of, my brain was ripe for information that would justify some of my behaviors and make me feel like something was within my control, and kind of all the things that we see when we talk about, the ways that eating disorders might develop or what might trigger them.
Yeah, you were totally vulnerable at that time. It sounds like a really impressionable period and also a period in your life when you needed some kind of like anchoring. So
right.
Disordered eating really comes in at that time. And then also like learning that stuff in your nutrition classes too. I feel like there's this desire that so many of us have to like be a quote unquote good nutrition student, right? And to
my gosh,
get it right. And so even if like your professor making that offhand comment about French fries, even if that was like not a rule that they followed, and if they were like just kind of saying it because it was just an example that they pulled out of thin air, but then you turn that into a food rule, it's like, I feel like they never, like nutrition professors and people who disseminate nutrition information never really know how it's going to land with people. And oftentimes it does get twisted into these black and white rules.
Right. Yeah. And I spent, most of my freshman year just adopting more and more rules, like just piling them on. And there were so many red flags in terms of my health that I just blatantly ignored. And because I was so far from any of my family, I think no one could really have known like how bad things were. So, my friends that I made at college, like that's all they knew. So there was nothing to compare it to. And I did make a lot of effort to appear as a very quote unquote normal eater in social situations, like ordering things maybe I wouldn't normally and trying to kind of venture out of my comfort zone. Because there was like always this kind of paranoid part of my brain that was like, what if people catch on, or like, what if they think that what I'm doing isn't healthy? Like I didn't have a lot of confidence in what I was doing because I actually hadn't declared my major as a nutrition student. So I only had that one class my freshman year. And then I waited until I was a sophomore. And that's when I did all the science. So I actually had like a little break from a lot of that information. And even though during that time, my behaviors became worse and I restricted more and more. And I would actually say that in that phase of time, probably for 6 months, maybe close to a year, if I like knowing more that I do now about eating disorders, I probably would have been diagnosed as anorexic. And again, just didn't have the language, didn't see anything wrong with what I was doing. And a lot of my health concerns either were not really noticed or went ignored by me. And a lot of the times that I did interact with a healthcare provider, I think, like looking back on this now, it's a little shocking to me. But at the time, it was just like, oh, are you eating enough? And I would say yes. And they'd be like, okay. Yeah, like no other questions.
That's great. No follow-up. Yeah.
Right. Well, so the reason that most of the time, I avoided healthcare providers a lot. My dad is a healthcare provider. So I grew up kind of not having to go very often to the doctor. Like we went for checkups and stuff. But, if one of us was sick, we would see his partner. My mom would just like drive us down to the clinic and it would be no big deal. There was no like making appointments. Like, we just kind of, it was a different way to think about or to like grow up around healthcare. And so as a young adult, it didn't occur to me that I had to like make appointments and do all of that stuff for myself. So anyways, when I did see a doctor, I wasn't getting a period. And they really asked nothing about that. It was, again, are you eating enough? I'd say yes. Are you pregnant? No. And that's it. Moving on. So yeah, a lot of it just kind of went ignored.
I totally identify with that. I've shared on the podcast a number of times that I had a similar situation where I stopped getting a period at the end of college, and it was very much related to and due to my restrictive eating and overexercise, but nobody caught on. No doctor recognized it. I was going from doctor to doctor to be like, why haven't I gotten my period in months and months? And they're like, head scratch, like, interesting, like
weird.
Let's put you in an MRI machine. Let's do 1 million blood tests. Let's, all these different things, right? To try to figure out what it was. not asking the simple questions like, doing an eating disorder screening, right? And it was the same kind of thing where if they ever asked about food, which I don't even really remember them doing, I do remember them saying like, well, your weight, you're small, but you're not too thin, quote unquote. So it couldn't be that. And I'm like, like mental note, not too thin, get thinner, like
Right, exactly.
Of course, that's what it's going to be in the mind of a person with an eating disorder. It was just all this other stuff that had nothing to do with my actual problem. And then the solution ultimately was like, they put me on the pill. I also was diagnosed with Hashimoto's thyroiditis around that time, which I think was likely triggered. I mean, it runs in my family, but I think it was likely triggered at that point in time by the eating disorder. And my endocrinologist was like, well, sometimes period problems can be caused by, low thyroid, but now you're on this the right dose of Synthroid and it's been a few months and your levels are normal, your period should have come back. So it's not that. And so then there was like more wild goose chases and more misdiagnoses. I was misdiagnosed as having PCOS. All the while just being so disordered with food and not having anybody call me out. And then also getting more and more disordered because I was like, maybe the problem's gluten, maybe it's dairy, maybe it's this, maybe it's that, like cutting out other things to try to deal with this issue. And God, if only someone had just been like, I mean, not that I necessarily would have listened to them. I don't know, because I was probably in denial, but if someone had at least planted the seed, a medical professional had been like, let's talk about your eating, like real talk, like
yeah.
How much different would it have been? So I very much identify with that feeling of just being totally missed by providers, even though the disordered behaviors were raging and somebody really should have seen it.
Well, and especially I think now I've just spent a year working on a college campus in the health clinic. And like, if someone had lost a significant amount of weight their freshman year, that would have been a huge red flag to me. And obviously, if I'm seeing them, then I would notice that. And no one probably noticed that for me at Penn State because I didn't have any medical records there. But when I went home, my body weight was much lower than it had been when I went to college. And I'm like, why was that not an issue? Like, why didn't anyone think about that? Especially at a time where I should have still been growing and kind of coming into my adult body. So that's a little baffling to me as well. And not having a period, sadly, really didn't concern me for a long time. I didn't think very much of it because I kind of saw it as like an unsolvable problem because no one seemed that interested in it. I got none of the tests that you just described. Like none of that was an option, presented to me. And it was just sort of like, okay, well, here's the birth control pill and let's move on. And then my junior year of college, I was on campus over the summer for classes, and I noticed a flyer for a research lab that was recruiting women who didn't have their periods. So I could have put myself into that study, but what I did instead was email them and say, do you need any help in the lab?
I don't have a problem. I'm the solution.
Right. I want to come help. And I wish I could like bring myself into like 20-year-old Heather's brain. Like, what was I thinking? And so I did. I worked in that lab for about a year and a half. And that was the first time that I realized this could be an issue because people don't eat enough. And the way that study was designed, they were actually just they were focused solely on weight gain. So they had these like energy bars that they gave the participants, which like makes me think of Mean Girls. These like Swedish nutrition bars. So they had energy bars and they had to come in and do body weight checks, and they had activity trackers to make sure they weren't exercising too much. They had very low compliance and very low participation, as I'm sure you're shocked to hear. But that was like an introduction to me in sort of a backwards way of like what might actually be going on. And even though I didn't really do much to change it, it at least gave me that knowledge that I would eventually use for myself. But at the time I was just sort of like, oh, I wonder if I could get in there and like see what's going on and not tell them I have anything wrong with me, of course.
That's so interesting. And I feel like that so speaks to the winding paths that so many of us take and the weird ways that our brains work when we're disordered. Because I was very much the same way about like my nutrition and food journalism career. It was like, ooh, I'm interested in this stuff. And part of me maybe knew at some level that like I was obsessed with it in a way that was a little unhealthy, that it was obsessive, that it wasn't good. But I sort of channeled that and was like, let me use this obsessive knowledge that I have or this obsessive desire to learn more to like create a career for myself that's really interesting and get into a position. I mean, I didn't even really think of it in an intentional way at that point, but it was really like putting myself in a position of authority and power to tell other people how to eat and what to eat, and who was I to be doing that? I had no business telling other people how to eat and what to eat because I was so disordered myself. But in a weird backwards way, I think it ultimately did lead me to recovery, putting myself in that position and then being surrounded by people. I did ultimately get into like working full-time at a food magazine, which I think was really healing and helpful because I was surrounded by a lot of people who did have better relationships with food, much better than I did. And then eventually went back to school to become a dietitian and put myself in a space where I was exposed to information about, eventually exposed to information about eating disorders and learned about how to heal from disordered eating and stuff. So it kind of ultimately got me where I needed to go, but I wasn't really ready at the time, I think, to get there. So yeah, I don't know. It sounds kind of similar in a way where you put yourself in a space that could like plant a seed for you and help you see the path to recovery, but you weren't ready yet to actually take those steps.
Yeah, I wasn't ready to say I'm the one who could be in this study. I don't want to be the subject, but I'll definitely be behind the scenes in the lab processing urine. That sounds great. Yeah. And I remember saying to the advisor that I spoke with before I started my freshman year and saying, I think I could help people lose weight. I remember saying that. And I oh man, I cringe when I think about that. But by the time I graduated, I had very slowly walked back some of the more rigid behaviors. I wasn't restricting as much. I was a little more lenient with myself with certain foods. I was like welcoming back in certain things that I liked, but it was very, very slow and gradual. And by the time I was in my internship, I was like, I don't even know if I want to be a dietitian. This sounds like it sucks. I was like, I don't want to help people lose weight. I recognized by that point that what I did and the behaviors that I had followed for so long, that they were disordered. I wouldn't have said that out loud at the time, but I recognized it. And in my mind, I was like, I can't sit in front of someone else and give them disordered recommendations. Like I can't tell people to cut this out or eliminate that or cut their calories down. Like I just knew that was never going to be in my path as a dietitian. And I knew that before I even would have considered myself like healed of the disorder or treated from the disorder, but I at least knew enough to know like this is harmful and I can't bring this upon someone else.
How do you think you got that knowledge? Do you think it was working in the lab that kind of started to light the way for you?
Well, I think the other people in the lab had some of their own issues. So I don't know if it was that. I think part of it was just being in my classes, like once my junior and senior year, once you're really in the thick of the dietetic curriculum, you're mostly with the same people all the time. And I did a lot of self-preservation in that I didn't really become close to many people in the nutrition program. And instead, a lot of my friends were like liberal arts majors and had like more, I would say, normal relationships with food. And I surrounded myself with people that to me didn't seem to have a preoccupation with this stuff. And that did not include many of the people in my program. I mean, that's me projecting onto them. I can't say anything for sure, but it just felt like that wasn't a safe space for me. And so I think by the time I graduated, I had enough self-awareness to realize like, okay, a lot of my behaviors are disordered. I couldn't really undo all of them. I didn't have, we can't treat ourselves. So I couldn't undo all of them, but I had tried to work on a lot of them that I just could tell weren't healthy for me. And by that point, I hadn't had a period for 4 years. And then working in the lab, I knew like, this isn't healthy. I don't really know what else to do, but I know that this isn't healthy. And so I think going into my internship, I just recognized how disordered a lot of my behaviors were. I just wasn't entirely equipped to change them. So that was a really gradual process. But yeah, I think I just kind of had enough self-awareness to know like, this isn't healthy and I wouldn't wish this upon someone else.
I mean, that's huge. That self-awareness piece is amazing and probably helped save you from spiraling further down, right?
Right, exactly. It made me a little confused as a new dietitian, but I managed to deal with that somehow. I mean, I definitely still think those early years, I was still pretty orthorexic. I definitely clung on to the Michael Pollan era of nutrition information and watched food documentaries that changed how I ate. And, for some reason, I'm like, where was all my critical thinking and all of this? Like, where was that skill that we're taught in our studies to, look at things with a critical eye and question some of the evidence and do your own research? Like, for some reason, I did very little of that. And I really just kind of grasped on to things that felt healthy, but didn't feel disordered in my mind, even though, like, very much, yes, they were.
Yeah, I so identify with that too, the Michael Pollan stuff of being like, because it does seem at first glance like it's not as disordered, right? It's not about counting calories, or it is kind of about cutting out certain foods, but it doesn't really say that. At least Michael Pollan's work itself and work of that ilk doesn't say like, avoid these foods at all costs, but it says like, processed foods are scary and bad, and here's why, and then like make your own decision. And so, of course, if you've just been told that they're scary and bad, like, what are you going to do, right?
Are you even listening? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So it's sort of, but it feels quote unquote healthier and less disordered. And I also felt like that was like my step out of the most disordered space, like Atkins and calorie counting and, low carb and gluten-free for no reason and stuff like that. Although the gluten-free for no reason, I think, got tied up in the Michael Pollan stuff too, because I was kind of like, gluten is industrial and industrial is bad. It got wrapped
Big
up
food.
in that. Big food is putting gluten in everything and poisoning us. And I'm sure there are probably some people listening who are like, well, yeah, that's what's happening, right? So I want to say, like, for anyone who's in that headspace, just know that there is another way to look at things, and that is not gospel, and that actually, for me, and it sounds like for you too, and so many other people I know, that kind of thinking actually just really ruins our mental well-being, and oftentimes also challenges and worsens our physical health actually too. Like, mental and physical health can be really harmed by that kind of thinking, because when you start cutting out more and more foods and you start getting paranoid about like what's in your food and who made this food, suddenly all your attention is on food, and all your, you become obsessed with what you can and can't eat, to the detriment of so many other aspects of your life.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I remember I feel like I was more socially anxious around food during that time than I was when I was restricting. When I was restricting, I thought I was focused on health, but really I was focused on calories. And I could at least, mentally in my head convince myself like, well, if I eat this, it's not too many calories if I eat that. So like if I went out and did social things, like I still felt kind of in control. But then when my behaviors kind of evolved and my beliefs shifted over into this like, no processed food and ingredients you can pronounce and all that, the list of things, I felt like I had more social anxiety around food, because I'm like, well, did this person cook it from a box or did they cook it from scratch? And like, just like all these crazy questions in my head that now I'm like, who cares? But at the time it felt very important.
Oh, so important. I so feel that too. And like, I talk about this in my book, because, that era of thinking about nutrition, I think, is really what we're still in. I think the Michael Pollan, Marion Nestle, Eric Schlosser kind of thinking, Morgan Spurlock and Supersize Me, all of that stuff from the early 2000s, like really ushered in this phase of the wellness diet that we're in now, where it's like, it's not about weight and it's not about health. Although, of course, if you do this right, you'll lose weight. And of course, the quote unquote obesity epidemic is this big, scary, bad thing that we have to stop eating processed foods in order to stop or whatever. That's like their framing of it. But it's under this guise of like, but it's for health, it's for your well-being and for like the well-being of the planet, which like, who doesn't want to support the well-being of the planet, right?
Yeah, when you throw that in there, like, geez.
Oh, it's so much. There's so much pressure now. It's like, not only am I taking care of my own health and maybe my family's health, but it's like the whole weight of the world literally is riding on this. So, it's just so hard to get out from under that.
Right. Yeah. And I even remember when I was, I guess, at the first year of my dietetics career, I was, 23, 24, joined a bunch of my friends in DC in training for a marathon, which was definitely against my better judgment at the time. But I was like, well, they're doing it, I'm going to do it. And I was still so wrapped up in that mentality that even though I was eating more and I was at kind of more of a stable, probably healthy body weight for me at the time, I was still, like I said, very kind of restrictive with like the types of foods and things I felt comfortable eating and what was healthy and not healthy. And I remember, instead of buying or like trying out some of the sports products that people use on longer runs, which I now recommend all the time. But I was like so scared of all that sugar and all the processed stuff that I just brought like honey packets and like real like Lara bars and like little bite-sized pieces, which like, let me tell you, are not easy to eat while you're running. Like that's not what those things are designed for. And I just was like so rigid with what I would allow myself to eat, even while I was like training for this big, scary thing to me. I'm like, I was just so wrapped up in it. I couldn't even pause for something like that.
How did you start to get out of that? And also the running piece, I want to dig into that a little bit too, and how that all dovetailed with the orthorexia.
Yeah. So I ran my first like longer distance race as a senior in college because I guess I have a slight competitive bone in my body, like a very, very small one. But one of my roommates at the time had run a marathon and she wasn't really a runner, and I had played sports in high school, but wasn't really a runner. And I ran a lot in college as a form of exercise because I thought it was the best way to burn the most amount of calories. So that was my exercise of choice. And I thought, well, if she can do a marathon, maybe like she'll do a longer race with me. I didn't want to do a marathon, thankfully, because that would have been really detrimental to my health at the time. But so I encouraged her to sign up for a race with me. And we trained with each other. And so that was the spring of my senior year. That actually was a really huge turning point for me. I remember really vividly changing my eating behaviors around my longer runs, because at that point I had enough nutrition knowledge and had taken one sports nutrition class, or maybe like went to a lecture or something. I can't remember exactly, but had a little bit of sports nutrition knowledge in me. And so I was like, well, if I don't eat enough, I won't be able to do this run. And I really want to do this run. So while for many people, exercise can be very triggering, and I think that was true for me for a long time, for some reason, this particular event like really shifted my mindset. And so that spring, I actually felt like I was eating a lot more and I was more relaxed around food. And we just did that one race and then kind of moved on. But I was interested in doing more. And I knew for myself, I'm like, you can't do this if you keep restricting your food intake. You can't be the kind of runner you might want to be, or that might be fun for you, if you don't eat enough. And then when I moved to DC after my internship about a year and a half later, the first way that I made friends and connected with a community was to join a running group. So I met with a running group for about a year, and that's how I met a lot of my friends that I'm still close to. And it wasn't like not competitive, not serious, not intense. We just did. And then we would go get like French fries and beers afterwards, So it was just like a really relaxed environment around running, which helped me kind of shift my perspective. And again, it just kind of encouraged me and nudged me along and like loosening my grip on a lot of the food rules. And I wanted to be able to enjoy that physical activity. And it's an exercise that has always been fun for me and meditative for me. And so I was like, well, if I want to keep doing this, I have to take care of myself.
That's really interesting. So it kind of forced you to be less restrictive. And it sounds like you went into it for kind of disordered reasons, but there were also joyful reasons there too. And so like teasing that apart must have been a challenge.
Yeah, I would say the joyful reasons did not come for a long time. So in high school, I only ran if we had to for soccer, and I thought it was miserable. And we would have to do like, and I was like, this is the worst day of my life. And then in college, for a long time, I would only go to the gym and I would only run on a treadmill because one, I didn't know where I was going around campus. And two, I liked being able to see the calorie feedback. So I would only work out on machines for that reason. And then the machine limit is like minutes or something like that. But then when we started training for this event, I thought, well, there's no way I could do this on a treadmill. Like I'll go crazy. And so I started running outside. And that's, for anyone who's not sure, that's way more enjoyable than being in a gym. And granted, I went to school in Pennsylvania, so like our outside running time is very limited, but I really enjoyed it. It was spring. It was beautiful outside. Because I was eating enough and because I was finally shifting my behaviors, I felt really good when I ran, like I had the energy to do it. And so that felt really good and that felt kind of empowering. And then kind of going into my internship, I did a little less of it just because of timing and logistics, but I still kind of kept it as a form of activity that I enjoyed and tried to do in a way that didn't feel disordered. And then again, coming into DC, I just kind of hooked up with this running group. And then they were like, well, we're doing this race and we're doing that race. And they're all like low key and no one's trying to like win the race, So it just was like a very fun social part of my life for a long time.
That's cool. And it sounds like you stumbled into a group that was really balanced about it, not super disordered and stressed out about it.
Yeah, we did not have like the really intense, like long distance runners. Like I have had clients in the DC area who run with running groups that are really intense and like everyone's kind of competitive and they train together and they go get brunch, but they notice what other people are eating and everyone's like kind of restricting, like there are those circles, of course, in any sport world, especially when people are kind of in like the higher echelon of like ability and talent. But I've never been in that echelon, so not a concern for me. And yeah, it's just luckily I've always been able to preserve it as something that's important to me in terms of community and important to me in terms of like a way that I find I can enjoy challenging myself a little bit, but never, I've always drawn a good line with myself of saying like, if I step over this line, I know I'm going too far. And because I have that history of restriction, I'm very sensitive to it. Like it's not something I think about much anymore. But in my mid-20s, when I was, I guess, like freshly recovered and still very sensitive to certain triggers, I was really careful with how I preserved my boundaries, both with the way that I ran and the events that I chose to do or not do, and the people that I would spend time with. I'm like, I have to take care of myself.
That's awesome. What were some of the ways that you preserved those things?
I would say definitely being more mindful of like the running group that I was part of. So again, ours was like pretty casual. Everyone always wanted to go do happy hour. And I think I tried out a few other ones through like running stores or other groups that, I heard of through a friend or whatever. And if it felt like everyone there was like really competitive and they were like, oh, we would never go get drinks afterwards. I'm like, well, you're not my people. You're just not my people. And that's fine. So that was one way. And then after that first race that I did with all of my friends in DC, everyone signed up for a marathon. I was like, sure, why not? That didn't go very well for me. So it just wasn't that fun. I didn't enjoy the race. And I've done a few since then, but very much on my own terms, like making sure that my motivations are in the right place. And if it doesn't feel like the right race for me or I'm not into my training, then I just sort of scrap it. And I'm like, I'm just not into this and it's not fun for me. And I've also been really careful about how much of my life I allow it to take up, because it can be really easy to let something like that take a huge chunk of your life and start justifying all the things you do. I'm training for whatever, like insert the next race. And so I've always been really careful to do my best. I wouldn't say I've always been perfect about it, but I've tried to be careful with the way that I let it dictate other behaviors. So if it starts to influence whether I might go out with friends over the weekend or not, or if it influences how often I feel like I can do this activity or that activity or whatever, then I start to pull back and I'm like, this doesn't feel good for me. It feels a little out of balance.
That's awesome that you have that awareness and that it sounds like you've developed that over time and definitely wouldn't have had that if you'd started doing marathons earlier or races in general earlier.
No. Yeah, there would have been a black hole that I just launched myself into if I'd done it any earlier, that's for sure.
Yeah. And I think that's huge. Like that's such an important thing for people to be aware of about any sort of activity. But I think especially running and things like that are so part of people's disordered relationships with movement, that if you're in a place where you are feeling compulsive and disordered about it, it's probably not the time to really do it. And giving yourself that space away from it, or ground rules and hard and fast boundaries that if it takes up this much of my time or if it forces me to do other behaviors or whatever it is, then I'm not okay with that and it has to go, so that you keep it in its rightful place. And I know for me, so I ran track in high school as a sprinter. So I was really loved, and I still love just racing people, having just a quick little race, race you across that field. I don't know. There's something really, really fun about that. Just running as fast as you can for a minute,
Yeah.
So I would do the sprints, but we had to for training, we had to run longer distances and I hated it. It was the same thing that you were describing with soccer. I was just ugh, this is the absolute worst. I can't stand this. And often would knock off of track practice and go smoke pot with my friends or sneak over to my boyfriend's house when his mom wasn't home, or just other bad kid stuff. Cause I was not really, my heart wasn't in it. I just loved the thrill of the race. Right. But I mean, later, even though I hated distance running and kind of always have, like later in college when I became disordered about food, like guess what my exercise of choice was, right? Guess what I also like seized on running as like quote unquote my thing and sort of convinced myself that I liked it. And over time, like years later when I was recovered, I would occasionally still like jog around the neighborhood or something, but I would try to monitor my reactions to it, my experience with it, and was just like, ultimately, this isn't really fun for me. I always end up getting hurt or, I love just like being outside and experiencing different parts of the neighborhood and like being in the sun. Like that is something that I really value. But I had seen running as sort of like a vehicle for that. And then at a certain point, I was just like, what about just taking a walk? Like I'll get the same benefits, the same other stuff that I like about this without all the downside of the running and something that really doesn't bring me joy as a form of movement. And then I was like, oh yeah, problem solved. Like taking a walk is my new favorite thing. So, and I just had to step away from running. But like, I think I'm really glad that I had that long experience of childhood relationship with it. And then like how it changed in the disordered period of my life to sort of look back on and be like, oh, I actually don't like this. Like my child self didn't like this. My adult self doesn't like this. The only reason I sort of liked this for a while was just the disordered reasons. And so that was a helpful like trial and error to figure out.
Yeah, there are lots of activities I don't like at all, but running has always felt pretty good to me. It's always felt like a good part of my routine, so long as it feels good and like I'm able to do it. I mean, when I had my son, I took like 6 or 7 months off, and it was just like, okay, this is just the reality, like it didn't get to me. I didn't get wrapped up in it. It was just like, this is not a season of life where I'll be running, and that's just what it is.
And that's a sign too that you have a balanced relationship with it. Cause like, right. I bet if you had still been compulsive about it, it would have felt like, oh God, I got to get back and feeling guilty for not doing it and all that stuff.
Exactly.
And like having a kid too is just such a strain on your body. Like your body needs so much time to recover from that.
I mean, we are so undereducated in what it does to our bodies. And unfortunately for a lot of women, the only way you find that out is by going through it and realizing how little information is out there. And you kind of just have to figure it out for yourself.
Yeah. Oh, what was that like for you? How was the process of pregnancy and postpartum and all that stuff as someone who has struggled with orthorexia in the past? Do you feel like it dredged up anything or just brought diet culture into your face in a new way?
Yeah. Well, it will definitely bring diet culture into your face, whether you want it to or not. There is so much policing around what pregnant women should be eating and how often you should be eating it and how much you should be eating. And don't you dare eat for 2. That's not what this is. I mean, it's unbelievable. But something that I felt very grateful for when I was pregnant with my son is how like where I was at that time, because I had been introduced to intuitive eating, had adopted it into my practice. I felt really confident in like, what I knew about that and using a non-diet approach. And so for me at the time, I just felt like, wow, I got really lucky with kind of how this all fell into place. And also like prior to that, I didn't feel ready to have kids. So thankfully, like I was able to come into that space before I got pregnant. And then while I was pregnant, if anything, I just felt really annoyed by a lot of the diet culture and ignored it all the time and encouraged other people to do the same. And I just kind of realized like how screwed up our messaging is to women. And I know that there are good intentions, and I know like, no one is providing those recommendations and trying to make you feel bad, but the tone is almost always one of like, don't screw this up. And if you aren't doing this, you should be. And why haven't you been? And, just like there are a lot of ways to feel really crappy during that time. But I pushed a lot of that aside and felt pretty confident in what I was doing. And I felt really grateful that I was in a healthy place with food and my relationship with food. And so that I actually really enjoyed it. One thing that was kind of interesting that happened during my pregnancy was I had followed, I will say, like a plant-based way of eating for a long time. And first trimester, I had always joked, like, if I do eat meat again, if I ever crave it, I'll totally eat it. I'm not like restricting it, or I thought that was true at the time. And my first trimester, I was like, yeah, fried chicken needs to happen right now. Like like 5 minutes ago, actually. That's when it needed to happen. And I had always told my friends, I'm like, if I start eating meat again, the first thing I'll eat is fried chicken. And that was true. I made that happen. And I just had this,
So good.
yeah, I just had this like very strong craving for it one day. And that's like the one and only craving I had during that pregnancy. I never again felt like this overwhelming desire to eat a certain type of food. I mean, you have things that like sound good and things that don't, but I never felt like a craving that took over the way that that did. And so that night, my husband and I went out to dinner and got some fried chicken, and it was great. And then for the rest of the pregnancy, I just was like, okay, I'm not only eating fish as my source of protein. I'm lifting that restriction after many years, and it felt great. And some people in my life are still surprised by that, like 2.5 years later. But yeah, so that was kind of interesting because I definitely wasn't expecting it, but I'm grateful for that last little nudge to let go of like the one thing that was kind of hanging on. And even though in my mind at the time it didn't feel disordered, I think I can see that a little differently in hindsight.
Yeah. And I feel like that particular restriction is really tricky, right? Because it's like the environmental piece or the animal rights piece and, sort of thinking of it as like an ethical decision is so that's really pushed on us, I think, in our culture. And it's pushed on us to think it's our responsibility to save the planet by not eating meat or not eating animal products, which like is such bullshit. There are so many ways to help save the world and save the planet that don't have to do with personal food consumption choices and don't have to do with personal choices whatsoever. Because really, like, I saw a statistic recently that was like, I might get the details wrong, but I think it was something like 70% of the carbon emissions are due to like 13% of the companies or something like that. It was like the lion's share of carbon emissions are because of corporations, not because of individuals, and like, it's corporations that our consumption choices aren't influencing. It's not like vote with your dollar. It's petroleum companies that like, I'm sorry, even if you don't have a car, you're using it, because it's like what everything runs on, right? You're having to, if you're ordering something or buying something in a store, it was shipped there using petroleum products and it was made using petroleum, there's no way around it. And so this idea that it's like personal responsibility to save the planet through our food choices is just ridiculous. And also for the people who want to eat that way for like animal ethical reasons, I totally get that. But it's so tied up with oftentimes the disordered beliefs about food and about health that make it really hard to like actually eat that way without having the disorder, the flames of it be fanned a little bit.
Right. Yeah. So a friend of mine and a colleague of ours, Taylor Wolfram, she's a intuitive eating dietitian who talks a lot about veganism and ethical veganism. And she has always said, and I love this so much, like if it only stay vegan if it's healthy for you, right? So she's like, I support people who know that based on their history or their triggers or whatever, that they need to have the option to eat animal foods, and maybe they still choose not to do it very often, but they need to have the option. And that was like something that really stood out to me as soon as I lifted that restriction on myself. I was like, wow, it feels so good to go to a restaurant and be able to choose anything instead of scan the menu for what might work. I didn't realize how much I had missed that. And also it had been so long since I'd allowed myself to do that anyway, because in college and like later years of high school, I didn't do that. Everything was like, what looks healthy, like scanning for like what I thought was the right choice versus like looking at a menu and just deciding what sounded good. So having that option back in my life was like freedom, it's like, wow, this feels amazing.
That's so great. And I feel like pregnancy is often a time too where people like shed those last bits of restriction, or even if they're super disordered going into the pregnancy, have like a reprieve from some of the restrictions, because there's this cultural mandate of like, you are responsible for growing this other human is like so messed up in so many ways. But I think one like weird silver lining that it sometimes has is sort of people think, okay, well, I can't mess up this kid by restricting my eating too much. Like I can't mess them up by starving them, basically, which is really problematic in and of itself. But I think sometimes gives people that little nudge into like dropping some of the disorder.
Yeah. I mean, I think even for me, even going into it feeling like I had a much more balanced relationship with food and exercise, there were still some things that struck me when I was like, oh, well, you have another human being to consider in this decision, like there were still some things for me that when I thought about maybe like doing a strenuous hike or doing another type of run or whatever, I was always like, I don't know, I want to do that, but is it the right thing to do? Like, does it really make sense? And it was really striking to me how much you are more willing to take care of yourself and to honor what your body's really telling you when you have another person to consider. And I found myself really curious, especially like in that kind of late first trimester, early second trimester, when you're really starting to feel pregnant and look pregnant. I'm like, wow, why was this so hard when it was just me? Like, why couldn't I just adopt that own belief just for myself, which I think I'm much better at now. But it is kind of interesting when you realize, you're willing to make those decisions when it's for the benefit of someone else versus just for you.
I'm curious how you got into intuitive eating in the first place, like so how your career as a dietitian kind of went from those early days.
Yeah, well, I was ready to not be a dietitian anymore. So I was very close to just like giving up on it altogether. I was actually on my like 5-year continuing education cycle. So I had put in all my hours and I was like, well, I guess I have the certification for another 5 years, but I'm not going to do anything with it. That was like my attitude at the time. So this was about 5 years ago and I quit my job. I was working with a corporate wellness company. It was very diet culture focused, not only like in our programs and our campaigns, but also the culture in the office was really kind of problematic at the time. I can't speak to it now, but when I was there, I noticed it a lot. And I was also, sensitive to it at the time. So I noticed it more often. But anyway, so I left that job and was really ready to just leave the profession altogether. And we were in California at the time, and I ended up getting recruited for this startup. And they were focused on health and wellness, but they were trying to take a different approach. So actually, when I think back on it now, this was 2015, I think that this company, and I'm still close to all the people that I worked with there, but they were way ahead of their times. Like basically, we didn't have the language for this, but what we were creating and what I signed on for as the only dietitian on the team was we're creating a non-diet inclusive fitness neutral space for content on the internet. And we didn't have that language. So that's not what we called it, but that's what it was. Like we didn't include, I was like, I refused to do any sort of like nutrition facts for our recipes. And I actually like got on this soapbox about using the word healthy. And I was like, no, we're not using the word healthy in any of our recipes or our fitness content. Like we don't know what's healthy for someone else, So I had all this creative freedom and I wasn't surrounded by other dietitians, which actually was like really refreshing for me at the time. But then we started, one of the projects that I was put on pretty early in the company was creating these online courses. And again, sort of a novelty at the time. There wasn't a ton of people doing it yet, so we didn't have a lot to work off of. But we were creating like month-long nutrition and like wellness courses. And I was focused on the nutrition part of that. And so I connected with some dietitians in the area, in the Bay Area. And one of them really wanted to do a course on mindful eating. And so we did a mindful eating course and did really well. People really liked it. And I was sort of just in charge of like helping her design the curriculum and lead the course, but then she was in charge of the content. And so I was learning a lot from what she was saying. And a lot of it had an undertone of intuitive eating. I just didn't know that. So I hadn't heard about it. And then at some point, it must have been brought up in conversation between the two of us or something. I don't remember exactly at what point I was like, oh, intuitive eating, it's a book. I should order it. I should read it. Like that happened somewhere, but I don't remember exactly where. I just know it was kind of an evolution of this course that we led on mindful eating. And so fast forward about a year and a half and the company folded the day after the 2016 election, which was pretty tough on all of us and a little jarring and for many reasons. And so I was like, okay, I have this intuitive eating book. I have this kind of fresh perspective. I have what I learned from being in a startup and kind of helping a business grow as much as we could. And I just decided to kind of do my own thing. And I thought, well, if I'm going to do my own thing, I'm going to do it on my own terms. And that meant like no more diet information, no more diet talk. started implementing that intuitive eating knowledge into what I primarily did, I had been doing on the side for a long time, which was sports nutrition, and just kind of took it from there and learned as I go, as most of us do.
Totally. Yeah, it's always an evolution. I'm curious too to talk about like intuitive eating and sports nutrition and how those jibe, because I think a lot of times people are really confused about how to use intuitive eating with sports, and especially if you're recovering from disordered eating and, you know, maybe found a form of joyful movement that you like, but don't want to get sucked back into diet culture. It's really tough to find information about like how to support eating for performance in particular sports that isn't diety.
Totally. And what I have learned over the years of incorporating the intuitive eating philosophy into sports nutrition is that a lot of people can take sports nutrition and turn it into its own form of orthorexia. I mean, it is like everything I do is justified by this training cycle or this event I have coming up or this performance or, you know, you name it. People can become very rigid just around those specific times in their life. And then they seemingly have a normal relationship with food outside of that. But once you get into like training mode or, you know, preparation mode or whatever, it's the season is on. It's like, now I'm back to all my rigid food rules and I don't do this and I don't do that and I don't drink alcohol. And it's like, it all just comes like flooding back in. And so for me, because that's never the way I approached it with running, I felt like I had a good in with some of the recreational athletes that would come to me and just want a little guidance around a race they had coming up, or, you know, they're new to distance running and they don't know what to do. And so it was like, oh, great. You know, like, let's talk about it without a lot of rules and without a lot of restrictions. And I mean, what I mostly do is I say we have sports nutrition guidelines, right? We have science, we have evidence-based recommendations, and I'm not here to shove all those to the side. They're very helpful, especially when, you know, we're looking at different levels of athletics. We want to make sure we're providing our athletes with what's going to help them do their best and kind of keep their priorities and their goals in mind. But we don't have to let those guidelines turn into very rigid rules and behaviors. So with all of my athletes, I'll say my first goal for you is that you have flexibility with food and flexibility with your food choices, instead of saying, this is the only thing I can eat before a long run, or this is the only thing I can eat before I exercise. This is the only thing I can eat afterwards. You know, that's really common. And so I'll kind of like make little cracks in those behaviors and insert little cracks in all of those behaviors so we can eventually shatter them and say, here's like 20 different things that you can eat before you work out. It just depends on what sounds good to you that day, or what you have in your pantry, or what you have while you're traveling. So it's a lot of, you know, taking what we know about sports nutrition, again, not pushing that to the side, but reminding people that these are guidelines. They're not meant to be, you know, hard and fast rules. And they're also guidelines based on an average population. So you don't need to take that and use it as like a religion, you know, and use it as the one and only thing that you can do to be a better athlete. Something that I see really often at all levels of athletics is that people kind of find a plateau in their performance or their abilities or their skills with a certain sport. And then they're like, oh, but if I change the way I eat, I'll magically be an elite athlete, you know? And it sounds crazy when I say it like that. And I think sometimes when I repeat it back in a different way, it's like, oh, well, I don't really mean it that way. I'm like, but that's really what you're saying, is that if you change this one behavior, or you have this magical meal plan from a dietitian, which I'm not going to provide you, you'll have this silver bullet and you'll have this secret tool that no one else has. You know, that's how a lot of people see it. So it's kind of like walking that back, you know, like, this is not a silver bullet. This is not a magic plan. This is just me helping you make sure you have that flexibility around food. And my other top priority when I'm working with athletes is that you're eating enough. So, you know, is your hormonal balance healthy? Are you sleeping okay? Are you recovering from your workouts? Are you thinking about food all the time, or not feeling preoccupied with food? Are you eating regularly? So there's so many different things to consider with athletes, and just kind of helping them see like that flexibility and that idea of eating enough will take them so much farther than sticking to the rules and being really rigid about what they're doing.
I love that idea of eating enough too. I feel like that is my top priority with people I work with and just with anyone recovering from diet culture. I think that's like the first and the sort of most important aspect of intuitive eating really is eating enough, having enough. And that includes people who don't have enough like materially, people with food insecurity. It's like intuitive eating with food insecurity just means figuring out ways to consistently get enough and like figuring out, tools and resources that you can use in order to do that. And like, yeah, with physical activity, it's like, it is so important to have enough, especially if you're an athlete at an elite level who's competing and doing a lot of training and stuff like that. It's really hard to get enough too. So you have to make a real effort to do that. And having someone to give you that permission, I think is so important. Like the fact that you're a sports dietitian who's like, let's focus on eating enough and let's focus on not being rigid is so huge.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think also like what people don't realize when they do become so rigid about their food intake and potentially aren't eating enough is that then they're operating in a scarcity mindset. Again, assuming like the privilege of having food security and financial ability to support that type of lifestyle and that active lifestyle. Assuming those things are there, like if you're not eating enough, then that's taking over your thought process. And then that's affecting like the mental energy that you have going into a race or an event or a sporting game or whatever, so it affects all levels of what's important to an athlete. And yet there is always this kind of justified behavior of restricting because I need to look a certain way to be a certain type of athlete.
Yeah, so much of it is just about aesthetics and not actual performance. And I feel like when people, I don't really work with a ton of elite athletes, but definitely have known some people who competed at like collegiate levels who found that with recovery from diet culture and eating disorders, that their performance actually improved because they were getting more food, they're getting more fuel, and they were able to have more stamina, more strength, more endurance, like all the stuff improved because they were eating enough. And this idea, oftentimes very orthorexic mindset of like, I need to cut out these certain foods in order to perform well, or I can't eat this or that before a race or after a race or whatever. Like that stuff was actually hindering them and giving them less fuel and less energy than when they were just like much more relaxed about it and opened up to different options.
Right. And depending on the level that an athlete might be at, I'm also reminding them that if you are really focused on food and you think that food is going to launch you into this next level of being an athlete, you're probably ignoring or distracting yourself from the fact that the way you train and the way that your body recovers is actually what's going to make you perform better or, take yourself to the next level if that's important to you. So, with like a college athlete or someone who's trying to be elite or at least be in like age group competitive, if they're focused so intently on food, it's often a distraction from all the other stuff that's actually going to change their performance, right?
Which I think is so common in diet culture in general.
Right. Look at this shiny thing over here.
Yeah, totally. And with other health conditions too, I think the fact that we just don't have a magic bullet for so many conditions is frustrating. And I know as someone with chronic illnesses, it can be frustrating not to feel like Western medicine has all the answers, and certainly alternative medicine doesn't have all the answers either. Like no medicine really has all the answers. There are just some conditions that require management and like some hard work at staying on top of different aspects of self-care and also privilege to be able to do that self-care. And like, it's not about the food, like for me with Hashimoto's, it's like, I went down the gluten rabbit hole thinking that that was the solution. And that's so commonly told to people with Hashimoto's or with any autoimmune condition. And I've done now like deep dives into the literature and found nothing to support that unless the person also has celiac disease, which like, yeah, if you have celiac disease, you should be not having gluten anyway, because that supports your overall well-being. You have a genetic condition that, creates an inability to process gluten. So if you have gluten, it's actually going to affect all these other systems in your body, but that's only for people with celiac disease. And like all the research that exists out there that people, healthcare practitioners or quote unquote gurus will like point to and say, oh, if you have Hashimoto's or if you have other autoimmune diseases, you should be avoiding gluten. All of that they're pointing to goes back to people with celiac disease, which is not generalizable to the overall, the general population. And it just blows my mind. But like, I feel like it's such a common thing there too, where like food is treated as this magic bullet. Like you're going to magically feel all better. All your symptoms are going to go away. You're not going to have to worry about getting enough sleep. You're not going to have to worry about your medications. You can get off all your medications, right? It's like always the promise with chronic health conditions. And it just sends people on these wild goose chases. Or sometimes there's like the nocebo effect that happens, right? Where they, cut out foods thinking it's going to help. And so temporarily it does because of that belief that it's going to help. So that can get really confusing too, because I think it drives people further and further into these disordered behaviors. But again, it's like our culture, like putting the onus on food and putting the spotlight on food where there's so much other stuff we need to be looking at. And it sort of reminds me of that old metaphor of the person searching under the street light because that's where the light is, not because where they actually lost the thing that they're looking for,
Right, right. Well, and I think like what we're working against in the sports world too is so many elite athletes sharing what they eat. And I don't fault them for that. I like no more so than I'd fault them for like showing what running shoes they use, like it's just part of what they share. But I think what they really vastly underestimate is how much people grasp onto that. And I can't tell you how many times I've had a conversation with a very recreational athlete, meaning someone who just runs or exercises for health and like fits it into their life otherwise. They're like, well, but so-and-so eats this before she does her mile run. So that's what I need to do. And I'm like, but why? Like, how does that affect your life? And I mean, I never discount the effect that food and eating enough has on someone who is an athlete, like in that specific category of people. And like, I definitely think sports nutrition is important or I wouldn't do it, but I don't think it needs to be taken to this really crazy extreme in order for you to feel like you're doing it right.
And also, I think the intuitive eating part of it is so important because there is that body awareness too, right? Like when people I think it probably comes out the most when people are eating enough versus not eating enough, that feeling of like, oh, I actually feel better when I'm running, like that experience that you had where it was like, oh, it feels good now to do this in a way that it didn't before because I was over-exercising and under-eating.
Right. Yeah. And like suddenly you don't have chronic injuries and you're not putting your health at risk by following these rigid behaviors.
Yeah. Which is all lost. I mean, I feel like when people look to like some sports star as their guru for this stuff and like, oh, I should be eating what this person eats, it negates the sort of body awareness that each individual has. It negates that intuitive connection with our bodies that each person has, where it's like, oh, actually, I don't feel that good when I'm eating this way. Oh, this feels kind of not like enough food, or this feels restrictive, or I feel tired and I'm getting injured more. Maybe I should try something less restrictive.
Yeah. Well, and then in a very classic diet culture way, it also negates all the other things that elite athlete does and what they have access to and what their lifestyle looks like, right? Like we're forgetting like the 1,000 other things that factor in.
And their privilege, their like genetic privilege in just, economic privilege and genetic privilege in being one of the few that is able to attain that level of elite athleticism. There's just so many things that go into it that, are completely not down to food or movement, because some of it's not even how you train. It's just how you're built, how your body genetically is determined to be, and whether you have ridiculously long arms as a swimmer or whatever it may be,
Yeah, I definitely see part of my work as like an intuitive eating focused and HAES aligned sports dietitian being like having kind of real honest conversations about what you're capable of, and not saying that I discourage anybody from like chasing down goals or challenging themselves. It's like, let's be realistic about how this makes your body feel, how this fits into your life, and like what does that take away from you? If you're solely focused on this, what are you sacrificing, and does that feel worth it to you? And for some people, yes. For a lot of people, no. And we just have to kind of be aware of that and come to terms with it in some way.
Yeah. And I think too, the idea that you can just be an athlete, like you not even quote unquote be an athlete, but like you can move your body in a certain way, you can do a certain activity just for fun. And it doesn't have to be this elite thing, or you can get to a certain level with it and maybe not get any farther in your quote unquote career with it. And that's okay too. You don't have to be chasing down goals all the time either. If you really enjoy doing something, why not let that be its own reward?
Right. Find your joyful movement. What does that look like for you? How do you define that? And it gets to change too. Like with this season of life for me, I have a toddler. Like joyful movement looks very different these days. It means being by myself in a quiet space. Like, like maybe I don't get out for as long and I don't go as far, but I still enjoy it just as much.
Yeah. And just having it be whatever it is for you that's, a self-care moment, like not having to push yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Oh, well, it's so great to talk with you. I could talk with you forever, but I hear your son in the background. It's like,
sorry,
he needs mommy. No, it's okay. So I'll let you go. But thank you so much for all that you shared. And let us know where people can find you online and learn more about your work and everything that you do.
Yeah, so I am at RD Real Talk on Instagram, and I have a podcast called RD Real Talk, so you can learn more there. And then actually, just kind of fitting for this conversation, my colleague Kelly Jones and I are relaunching our Fit Fueling course. Actually, by the time this goes out, it will definitely be live. So if you are interested in sports nutrition and intuitive eating and how to merge those two for yourself, it's a really good introduction to that. So that is, I think, thinkific.com/fitfueling, or maybe fitfueling.thinkific.com. I'll have to get back to you on that. It's one of those two.
We'll put it in the show notes so people can find it. So when in doubt, go to the show notes.
Yeah, details not top of my head right now.
I hear that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here. It's really great to talk with you.
Thank you so much, Christy.
So that's our show. Thanks again so much to Heather Kaplan for joining us on this episode, and thanks to you for listening. If you've gotten something out of this podcast, please help us reach more people who need to hear the anti-diet message by sharing this episode and subscribing to the pod on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. You can see all the places to subscribe and share at christyharrison.com/subscribe. That's christyharrison.com/subscribe. And you can also leave us a nice rating and review in your podcast provider of choice, which is a great way to help new listeners discover us and is always so appreciated. If you're looking for some practical tips to help you get started on the anti-diet path, grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Just go to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we discussed, plus a full transcript, just go to christyharrison.com/222. That's christyharrison.com/222. And to get the transcript, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and enter your email address. This episode was brought to you by my book, Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is now available wherever books are sold. Just go to christyharrison.com/book to order it online, or pop into your local bookstore and ask for Anti-Diet. A big thanks, as always, to our editor and engineer, Mike Lalonde, our community and content associate, Vinci Chue, and our administrative assistant, Julianne Watasik, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into producing this show every week. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Meredith Noble, and our theme song was written and performed by Carolyn Pennypacker Riggs. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.